Today, Down the Rabbit Hole, Part 3. Hello again, it's Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics. Welcome to latest posts covering finance and problem news with a distinctively Australian flavour. Today, I'm joined again by George, and George has the tin foil hat on because we're going to go deep into the rabbit hole once again. Hi, George.
Oh, hi, Martin. How are you?
Pretty good.
Exactly. Just wanted to kind of start by saying that since we spoke last, we've had a few changes in our world with our COVID-19 and our shut lockdowns, etc. And I've been watching all this taking place and kind of guessing where the media strategy is going to go next. And now we're getting into the conspiracies again, but you know that's what we're here for. I watched the protesters in Melbourne. And I was careful to see what messages they were giving out. One of the protesters, Thanos, appeared on 60 Minutes, and I watched his interview. And they challenged him on a few things. I think 60 Minutes won the debate, by the way. But just the same, while they were talking to him, he mentioned things like vaccines and 5G, and he didn't believe that the COVID-19 was real. He even threw down the gauntlet that he didn't actually believe the media either. Liz Hayes actually said what you're saying, that you don't believe what we're saying, and he said that's right. So that's putting the conspiracy theorists, pushing their conspiracy theory back onto the media itself. But what's interesting about the protests in Melbourne, which I noticed, was they were talking about vaccines and 5G, and then Thanos talked about digital chipping, which digital money, the mark of the beast. He got into religion, which at that time when he mentioned that, the police came in and arrested him on the front of the Parliament House steps in Melbourne. But what's interesting is since that time, they had another protest a week later, and we had George... the Black Lives Matter, George, what was his name? The one that got killed supposedly in Minnesota or Minneapolis. And all of a sudden, I thought, as soon as I saw that, I thought, I know what's going to happen now. The media is going to focus on Black Lives Matter, and sure enough, next week, we had Black Lives Matter banners everywhere. And I was paying particular attention to Channel 9 as they were feeding live vision from the Sydney protests, and right down the back of the crowd they had banner after banner after banner of Black Lives Matter. I thought, yep, now what are you seeing? You're seeing a group of people with all the same banners, one after the other, and the camera then pans to the crowd with their backs to the camera, and you can see the size of the crowd. Now, you're getting what I'm saying here? Could this be manipulated? You know, the tin hat's on now. So I'm going to suggest tonight that really, could the media be complicit? I think yes. Have a look at, say, a country like China. Okay. What do people think of China's media with the Chinese? What do you think, Martin?
Well, it's clearly that the media is very much controlled by the government, and of course they have direct control of all the types of media and all the messages. So it's very much controlled and manipulated and positioned around the central position, which is the doctrinal position that China has.
Well, what I'm trying to say is that a lot of Westerners can look at China and say their media is controlled. Do they ever stop to think that our media is controlled?
Right. Yeah.
And how do you prove it? And there are examples where our media have told us things. Let's go back to 9/11, the classic time when Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction. And we were told he has weapons of mass destruction. He's the terrorist that was behind 9/11. We have to attack him and protect our liberties. Of course, they never found any weapons of mass destruction, and yet we're still there. And our media told us, along with the politicians, etc., that weapons of mass destruction existed in Iraq. If you see what I mean. I'm just trying to give you some little... Now, how many...
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting because if you talk to the media, they'll claim that they are objective and independent and unbiased, right? So, the BBC is the classic example of that. So they say they go out of their way to make sure that they get all the views and, don't take sides and what have you, right? That's the official positioning of pretty much all of the medias. Now, there are others, I won't mention them by name, who actually clearly are doctrinally aligned to one particular political party. And so therefore they tend to take a particular view all the time around that particular party and that particular dimension. And in a way that's probably more honest in a way than the ones who claim to be objective, independent and balanced.
Well, that is the question, isn't it? We've got the ABC that's meant to be balanced. And I've spoken to people who've got political views, and of course they've always been towards the one they like. But liking something and the truth are two different things. And if the media disinform, that's a problem. And it's a problem that, because we rely on our media to keep us informed, so if they disinform, we've got a problem.
It's quite tricky, right? Because effectively, by definition, any media outlet is making decisions about what to feature, what not to feature, what to prioritise, not what to prioritise, how much airtime to give X or space in the newspaper to Y or online. So they are always making editorial decisions and they're selecting and prioritising. And the critical question is, to what extent is the decisioning that they're doing really objective? Or are they actually able to take particular lines and positions based on a particular set of doctrines or ideas? Or indeed, are there people whose job it is to make sure that the balance in the storytelling is appropriate for the particular agenda that they have? I don't know the answer to that, but it's certainly not as straightforward as many people would assume, I think.
Well, I have been researching since 2011. And remember when we spoke about peeling the onion and you keep finding things? What I've discovered is over in America, I came across a video link that said alternative media is extremely dangerous to our democracy. I thought, that's fine. And then another picture came up, same line. Now, these are all different networks. And then another one. Before you knew it, the whole screen was smothered in like 30 images of everybody repeating the same line.
No.
Now, that's control. That's as much control as you'd expect to see in Chinese media, the CCP, putting out information to their people. Except that in the West, we believe that the communists' regime is dictatorial and our regime is democracy. And so just we could go on about it, but that's something you may want to look at. And if they are independent, why are they all saying the same line?
Yeah. Well, there is a very interesting observation, which I have, is that pretty much wherever you go, you see the same stories pretty much in the same sequence with the same orientation. There is really very little diversity of opinion in Australian media, particularly the TV channels. They are almost interchangeable in some regards, I think.
Well, that's a worry in terms of we rely on them for information, and I'm suggesting that we're getting disinformation from what I've seen.
Right.
I'm also suggesting an example. If you go back and you listen to John Howard and the Prime Minister of Canada, when they gave their support behind the Americans and the British to invade Iraq, both John Howard and the Prime Minister of Canada made exactly the same speech. Yep. Now, these things I find a little bit odd because we're meant to be a sovereign country, but yet we're making the same speeches. So I've seen a lot of little things that have really... I noticed the most minute detail, you'd be surprised. I'll give you an example. In Q&A, we had David Hicks and John Howard speaking, and watch this. As they cut away to an audience member, one of the audience members, as a medium close-up, does this. And then they cut back to John Howard talking. Then they cut to two audience members. And both audience members did. Do you find that a little odd?
Did he want to know?
What are the chances? What are the chances? I'm
so
suggesting.
What are you suggesting? I don't understand.
Well,
post
post-production.
Signalling in some way.
You do post-production.
Right. Yeah.
Okay, so how easy would it be to take something and turn it into something else?
Yeah. Well, that's the point. And of course, and I know because we're both involved in television production that you can actually make anything look like anything, right?
Of course, I could take an interview. Yeah. I've seen comedies made where people actually take somebody who's talking and then they throw in their own lines and then they respond. It's comical. Yeah. But imagine doing that in a situation where you want to change the narrative. And there's many examples, Martin, of this sort of thing going on. I'm not here to talk about just the media per se. I'm more interested in the fact that to look at the world that we live in today and have a look at what has taken place. Because, look, you and I are about the same vintage. And we can look back over the last 30, 40 years and you can see how society's thinking and the way they... once, if I remember when I was a kid, the idea of calling somebody sort of a derogatory name, as much as I didn't like it, it was like the norm. Now, today, they're so hypersensitive about anybody saying anything that even if somebody commits a crime, like in the case of Melbourne where we had Sudanese gangs attacking people, and you mention it, and then suddenly you're called a racist because you're calling out a crime. But you're called a racist because you mentioned the word Sudanese. But if we're rational, you're not calling out the whole Sudanese community. You're calling out a small group. So I don't see that as being racist, but how do you identify the person who's enacting the crime? How do we identify, how do we find them? If you see what I mean.
Yeah, no, and the fact is that there is a hypersensitivity today that there certainly wasn't a few years ago to a lot of those sorts of things, and people are worried about gender and politics and race politics and all those things, right? So and of course they've recently started taking down television shows that a few years ago were shown like Chris Lilly in Australia, or even films in the US, and they're now in the US talking about banning the Confederate flag because of the sensitivity around it, and you sort of stop and think about that twice. Well, what you're basically doing is one, filtering history, and I keep thinking of 1984.
Oh, yes, now we get it.
1984, right? The people are employed to essentially edit history, right?
Wow.
To align it to the current reality that they want to project, right? Yep. Now, I actually think that 1984, is actually a very important story, but it's also a very important understanding of what can be done and is often being done. And of course, the point there was that Orwell, when he wrote it, whilst he had one eye on, a fictional future generation, he was writing about the current as well.
Yeah.
So I've always believed that you need to ask questions about, well, who's editing history? Who's editing the stories that you see? To what extent do you go back and change the narrative from previously based on new evidence or new perspectives or new sensitivities? And the answer is, once you start on that slope, the whole thing gets relative, because effectively you start to realize that history is not factually 100%, right? History is normally told by the victors.
Yep.
History is normally told with a particular objective or set of objectives in mind to reinforce particular values or outcomes. And again, what it means is that effectively the narratives that you're taught at school, the narratives that actually are in all the textbooks, the way that you talk about things is all effectively filtered, right?
Correct. That's exactly right. And so here's the thing. I actually, and you may probably have your thoughts on this, believe that we are controlled by a small group of people that run the world. And the world is actually played like a game of chess. Right. And I look at our political system in Australia, this is just to branch out to where the world is, and I see we have a Liberal Party and a Labor Party as our two major parties. And they're virtually one in the same. And then if you expand that thinking to international, how about we looked at all the international leaders and they are all one in the same? In other words, this I don't know if you remember, I think it was 1991 when George Bush Sr. said we have a real chance for a new world order where the rule of law, not the law of the jungle, and a credible United Nations will come together in common cause. Now, 1975, Australia joined that United Nations, and effectively our politicians seem to follow what the United Nations are expecting from us all. So it looks to me very much from what I've seen that we are heading towards a one world government, and the politicians, the international politicians, are actually united, strangely as it seems. Now, if you're wondering how they're united, well, I'm getting a little bit controversial here, but Freemasonry.
I think you've already gone past controversial, George, if I'm honest. So before you go on, let me just make a couple of comments, right? Yeah, so there was a lot of talk about the New World Order, right? And in fact, if you look at some of the comments in some of the YouTube videos that I put up and other people quite often refer to it, right? And I guess that part of, as we said, I think in our first one, right, that you either say there's an alignment of interest and alignment of thinking that essentially means that people go in the same direction and think the same things, and you could say the central banks are doing the same and the political establishment are doing the same, which doesn't require somebody at the centre pulling the strings, as it were, right? So that's one way of explaining it, and I think I may have told you I tend to sort of go for the cock-up theory of history rather than the conspiracy theory of history. But
that's fine. There
is another angle that says no, actually this is more controlled, this is more managed than my explanation for what's going on. In which case you then have to start asking the question, well, if there is some sort of more central coordination plus control plus, then what entity or entities is effectively standing behind what we're seeing as the public face of government and the public face of public policy and those international organisations like the IMF and the OECD and all of the others, the World Bank.
There lies our pyramid. I think you'll find that, and this is the thing, to talk about pyramids and to talk about monopolies. I think if you looked at a pyramid in its simplest form, have a look at a small office with a group of people working in it, and there's the manager, and then there's like a hierarchical structure of a secretary and, let's say, lawyers or accountants, and they service a group. But then above them, there's another pyramid structure that they work to, and then they have their pyramid structure. And if you add all these little mini pyramids together, you end up with a very fine tip at the very top of the pyramid. Yep. And it goes all the way to this one kind of driving force or controlling force that sits at the very top. So if you look at,
are you saying that's beyond with an individual country? Basically, you're saying that these pyramidal structures basically aggregate up to something which sits above the country level.
That's what I see in the world. I know it seems extraordinary, but I have been, while you've been looking at economics, etc., and we can't look at everything, but believe it or not, I mean, our whole world is controlled through money. Think about it. If you stop the money supply, the whole economy just stops. Simple. Yep. And we've got this COVID-19 and small businesses that have stopped. Go on.
But that is precisely why I'm very critical of central banks and the way that central bankers work. And you can see that pyramid, right? Because you have central banks in each country. Then you've got the Bank for International Settlements, which effectively is the central bankers' bankers, right? And they all come together and they all think the same thing and they all have the same doctrines that then get cascaded back down through into the individual countries. That is absolutely, explicitly what is happening. And in fact, the people running the central banks are also part of committees at the group centre, as it were, who actually determine what is done and how it's done. So that is that's visible. So what you're saying is, and you can take that even further and you can bring other elements, beyond financial services and elsewhere and beyond the banking system, and you can see the same thing. That's what you're saying?
That's exactly what I'm saying. And if you think about it...
But the question then is, what is at the point of the pyramid?
That's a good question, Martin. That's the part.
Who's in control?
That is the part that I've been wondering about, and we almost border on religion here too, by the way. Okay. And then, hang on, get a load of this. How much has religion been infiltrated in the process? You've got to consider that, because every little aspect, if all these things have been manipulated, there's no doubt religion has been manipulated. So that's another pyramid, right? But you're not saying that religion is driving all the other pyramids. You're saying religion is one of the pyramids, right? I'm saying, from what I can see, you can kind of see where power is structured. I mean, the Bank of International Settlements, the City of London, the European banks. That's the financial centres. That seems to me not to be the same as what you're saying. No, that's fine. What I'm saying is that I think they're the top end of this is the Vatican. Okay.
Right. Oh, okay.
Okay. Yeah. City of London.
Okay. Tin Hat Time Part 2.
I know.
So the Vatican, City of London. Yeah, go on.
And then you'd have to say the Federal Reserve Bank, because it's the reserve currency of the world.
Right.
And I think these three are working together. Now, that's an awful lot of power. There are other things too that are involved. You've probably seen the situation with Prince Andrew and the pedophile thing that has been going on.
Yep.
And the more I read into this, the more I find that there's an intricate structure of secret society combined with this combination of money control. And this is all about control. It's okay. I'm going to say it. You don't have to say it, Martin.
Well, no, I mean, it sounds more like a Dan Brown novel, right? That there's a secret set of powers behind the face of power, and they're pulling all the shots.
Well, the way I see it, even the secret societies work on a pyramid system, and they support each other all the way up to the top. I know, it's okay. You can have a laugh.
Okay.
Someone's got to say this because that's what we're here.
No. Well, I mean, I find this pretty remarkable, and
that's all right. It's okay, but being that it's done in secret makes it very, very difficult to break apart.
You'll never prove it. But then the question is, what's at the top of the top of the what's at the top of the top of the top of the pyramid?
That's the part. That's the part that I've been trying to find out. It looks to me like it's the head of the United Nations, because they seem to be spearheading this push towards a one world government. Right. That's what it looks to me like. It's very, very difficult.
And who pays for the United Nations?
We all pay. We contribute.
Well, the US pays a significant proportion.
Well, I think you'll find Australia contributes as well.
No, we do as well, but in terms of the relativities.
But here's an interesting thing. So we have a situation where monopolies, which are pyramids, all over the place. So what do we have? In Australia, we seem to be going continually down the path of stronger and stronger monopoly corporations. We've got situations where banks have been found to be money laundering. and I think it was they pay a fine, but they get to keep
Small
most
fine.
of their profit. So,
Yeah, exactly.
and then just about everything that we do. Now, we've also got a society that is becoming more and more interconnected through these monopolies. So we have a situation now where if Martin wants to run his studio, Martin has to work with the utilities companies, and you have no choice unless you run your own power. But you're pushed towards this direction no matter what. So you've got, let's see, you've got monopoly power, monopoly water. You've got councils that, in effect, have a monopoly power over us, even though we can vote for them. But if we vote for them and then a lobby group comes in and takes over, then our democracy is not working, clearly. Would you agree with that, Martin?
Well, I mean, it seems to me that the appearance of democracy is that we have a vote and we exercise that vote, and on the back of that, then people are actually given responsibilities to act on our behalf. Right? That's the sort of the theory of democracy. The practice is the practice is that they often are there for their own ends. Some, I think, are truly there to try and actually make society better, but I suspect a lot actually are more interested in self-preservation and their own ends. But you make a very valid point, which is if you look at the way that commercial structures tend to work, they tend to get bigger, they tend to actually want to dominate, and they tend to want to actually control. That is a function, I think, of capitalism. And essentially, there is an argument that's been around for a long, long time that says that in a capitalist environment, companies get bigger, they get more powerful. In fact, in many places, countries are less powerful than companies are, particularly large international
Actually, it's a very good point, Martin.
And they actually, if you look at the amount of money inside some of these companies, they are way more valuable than countries, right? So you've got this overlay of, or a matrix, depending on how you want to look at it, a matrix of international companies and local companies, all effectively competing, getting bigger, creating less and less diversity as a result of it. Right now, I actually believe that is true, without necessarily buying into your who's pulling the strings at the top of the pyramid sort of thing. Corporations don't necessarily do what's in the best interest of consumers or in the interest of their end customers. Corporations work in the best interest of their shareholders and in the best interest of the longevity of the corporation.
Well, yes, and I think you'll find that a corporation is always looking to create a monopoly in its own area, so it has no competition and can grow.
But that's what capitalism allows you to do. Capitalism says if people are dumb enough to allow us to get too big and effectively exert our authority and our pricing power, so that you have to pay a lot more, that's perfectly within the scope of capitalism.
It is, except that there's a sinister side to it.
I knew you'd say that.
Well, think about it. Think about where this is going. If a corporation can create a monopoly, before too long, let's see, if you want to do anything, you need money. As far as, say, creating a business or buying a house or whatever. And we've got a situation where there's such a monopoly now that the only way we can actually buy things is we generally can't actually save enough money quick enough to buy a house. So we're forced to go to a bank and borrow.
Yeah.
Otherwise, we're just not going to get there. In the meantime, what's that telling you? It's telling me that we've created a situation where people virtually they don't have to go and borrow money from a bank, but if they don't, under the circumstances we have at the moment, they're probably never going to buy a house.
Well, I would say that from a very early age, people now are educated that debt is good, more debt is better. You get a credit card when you're young, you get HEX debts when you actually go to university, you're expected to take on a mortgage, etc., etc., etc. All of that ultimately is about effectively getting you as an individual to buy into this particular system because you have to, quite rightly, if you want to progress, because that's the way it's developed. But you are also a slave to the system at that point, because then you have to continue to make those mortgage repayments and those other debt repayments until either you pay it all off, very hard these days because the loans are really big and the incomes aren't growing, or you basically carry that debt burden all the way through your life. And if you're lucky, you might you might be able to bequeath it to your offspring when you depart, or basically, yeah. So debt is wired in to the way that society works, and debt is a fundamental issue. I've always said that's a major mistake. People haven't been educated sufficiently to understand the implications of what this means. It means you're completely subservient. So you are a debt slave, just like you were in the Egyptian times when you were a slave there, right? Nothing as much has changed. The language might have changed, the distribution mechanism might have changed, but the basic philosophy hasn't changed. And by the way, the neoliberalism view of this is that if you have debt, you must pay it to the last cent. There are very good academics who say, without some way of breaking that debt cycle, you actually end up with just a subservient society, with a very small proportion of the society, being benefited from that, but everybody else not. And I buy into that quite strongly. And I think that people walk into this from an early age, not understanding really where it takes you, but then actually are caught in the system. And okay, interest rates are low, so people can get even bigger debts today. And then when we have COVID, the banks say, well, we'll just postpone your repayments for 6 months to allow you to get through. Well, or we will switch you to interest only. All of that is doing is postponing the inevitable and increasing the payments that they're going to receive over a longer period of time.
That's true. And I think you'll find George Carlin, I've mentioned him on the first episode, and somebody said, you just spoke about him as if he was a nobody. But no, George Carlin is an American comedian. He says, you don't have any choice. You have the illusion of choice, but you don't have a choice. And I think that's what monopolies do. They take choice away. So if we look at our system, it's become more and more integrated to the point where we can no longer rely on ourselves. We can't sustain ourselves unless we're locked into the system. Do you see what I'm saying? So we've been locked into this system.
Or you go totally off grid and therefore go outside of the system. And there are people who do that, but
there are
very marginally. Yeah,
of course,
very marginally.
And so,
yep. But then if you then take that a bit further and say, and then there's a level of manipulation and control. We talked about manipulation through the media, control, especially, of course, with the digital world that's now here, so that effectively we are digitally connected. Some would say digitally tagged, although I think that might be going a bit far. But
I don't think that's going too far.
No, indeed. And if you look at China's the archetypal example probably of where artificial intelligence has now been installed within the system there to be able to track people and monitor people and control people.
I'm glad you mentioned artificial intelligence, by the way.
Yeah.
Because I think you'll find it's a lot more invasive than people realise. A lot more. And look, there's a whole lot of things that I've noticed that when you go looking for something, artificial intelligence will take you to where it's tracking you. And so if you're looking at a particular thing, you probably noticed this, that you'll click on something, it seems to take you to the sites that you're interested in, and does the same with everybody. So you've probably heard the term...
That's to do with cookies, isn't it?
Well, it's to do with cookies, etc. But you've probably heard the term...
They build a profile. So you're sharing information. Every time you interact on the web, right, you're actually building your profile. That profile is effectively then stored, used, manipulated by the big internet players, be they Google or whatever, right, or Amazon, who then actually can serve you with particular experiences based on their algorithms, which are, of course, are AI-driven, to be able to actually tailor. So if you, I mean, I don't, you've probably done this, but, if I've gone searching for a particular thing, I suddenly get lots of adverts for that thing.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
And that's all to do with cookies and all that.
Sure,
that's a critical part. But that's just the tip of the iceberg, as it were, tip of the pyramid. But you could take it further. So, if you go back to China and the social score, because what they then said is, well, actually, not only your interactions on internet, but also things like what you buy, where you buy it, the views that you express, all of those things are essentially part of the profile that is built of you. And of course, then the question is, if that profile then includes access to funds, as you said earlier on, and then you actually in some way cross the line and you then become persona non grata, then effectively they can just turn it off. And then what do you do? Because then you're actually effectively persona non grata and not able to participate in the society or the financial system that is required to continue. So, I mean, this, maybe I'm now getting conspiratorial, but that's what I worry about.
I think you're making some valid points. I think if we just look at, say, the COVID-19 situation right now, and we've got a Liberal Party in power that is against government debt. Well, so they say they are. Okay. And what are they doing? They're going into debt, which is the very thing they accuse the Labor Party of. And this is where I go back to this idea that both parties are one in the same. And I think of it like a car with drive and reverse. Drive is for the Liberal Party and reverse is for the Labor Party, except that when they do put the car into those gears, they use fuel, we'll call that money, or debt. And money is debt, because I don't see money as anything but debt, because it has no intrinsic value. It's a fiat system. Yeah. So every time we put money into the system, we've got to grow it even more and more and more. Unless we have continual growth, we could slip into a recession. And that's what can happen. So I don't see them being any different. And I explained this to a friend of mine who kind of got it. But I think that what we're heading to, if you actually look at the Chinese system, and the Chinese system works on a point system, that if their people get high points and they're close to government, they do very well. In the case of the Western countries, if we get a lot of money, we'll call that points, we do well. Now, if you look at America, which is supposed to be the free country of the world, and what do we have? We've got a situation where a lot of the choices that people have are gone. They can't run small businesses because they can't compete against the big monopolies. Consequently, they can't earn enough money anymore to even eat, so they have food stamps. So the government pitches in with all these little cards. Of course, the food stamps go to a corporation, so the corporation can make its money. So they're forced to go in a particular direction. They're being controlled. I don't see Australia being far off that. I think I can see us going down that path. And now, of course, universal income. Now, once we get to universal income, there's something, well, is the system working anymore? Because now we are totally reliant on the government. Some people would call this communism, okay? Communism and fascism are one in the same. Oh, I can see you smiling. It's okay. But this is what I see. I mean, have a look at what's happening. Ask yourself, just look at what do we have? We've got controlled food, GMO. We've got large supermarkets that sell processed foods. Processed foods often are not necessarily good for you, so you're probably not going to get sick. Of course, that plays into the hands of the pharmaceuticals. And you've also got monopoly banking, in a sense. We could say it wasn't, but really, I mean, you've got a central bank that sits at the top, and then you've got a couple of service providers called, Commonwealth and Westpac and ANZ, etc., who then compete on margin, and then we fight amongst them. And then you've got, what else have you got? Just about everything. Monopoly of electricity. Again, a couple of service providers, again, controlling. And then you've got a government that we vote for that goes off on tangents and creates policies like the Trans-Pacific Partnership, where a corporation can sue a country if it loses profit. I mean, how would it be if you went to a shopkeeper and you bought something and the shopkeeper wasn't satisfied with their profit and they sent you a letter in the mail with a solicitor's note saying, I know you only paid $100 for that, but we want another $50 for it because we didn't make enough profit this year. I mean, any person in their right mind, would they accept a deal like that? supposedly but this is what's happening. Now, if we go back to the times of Thatcher and Reagan, and they talked about neoliberal policy, and they said government was the problem and should get out of the way of business. I'd say they did do that, but they didn't do it with small business. They did it with big business. So what happens? Big business gets carte blanche on whatever it likes, because it's the big bully in the ring. And if you ask a small business person how they're going, you've got the media, the government constantly telling them that incomes are too high, we're not competitive. So they focus on that. They never focus on the other costs, like the cost of government, the rates, the higher cost of rent, which have to be then, they have to be able to pay that. Those costs have got to come out of their profit. And of course, it's nice for a government to come along and say, we're going to do away with penalty rates of your employees and you'll be better off. Well, that's fine. You get a one-off hit there. Those employees have to earn money to spend, but they play us all against each other. It's this divide and conquer. You see my point? And so small business gets trodden on, while big business, behind closed doors, huge contracts which benefit them, but do they benefit society?
Well, the answer is quite often not, right? Because essentially, I've always had the theory that you can put politics and big business on one side of the equation, right? And then you can put ordinary Australians and small businesses on the other side of the equation, right? And you can see where all the flows of money go, and all the tax breaks and all of the incentives. It all goes into that big business, tax breaks, international tax treaties, all those things that basically favour the big guys. Going right back to our earlier conversation, and I keep coming back to this bifurcation of society between that big business, big politics end of town, and then the real economy, real people, real households, real small businesses. And certainly my surveys, both on small business and on consumers, say people are really up against it. And that we said earlier on, they're caught with the in the debt trap and everything else. But there is something weird in terms of that alignment, which essentially means that all of our taxes, that we pay the taxes, and then it goes into the government coffers, and then it suddenly goes out into the big business end of town, and big business get breaks for all sorts of things. It is not very equitable, and I think it's become less and less equitable over recent years, and yet it's still got that superficiality of democracy, and it's got we voted this in, and I say
democracy's been hijacked, Martin. That and what I mean by that is, it's like George Carlin says, you have the illusion of choice. You have no choice. You have privileges, but you have no choice. And I think he's a fantastic. You should watch him, by the way. He sums up so many things. Like, he talks about the Civil War, and he talks about slave owners going to war for freedom. Slave owners going to. I mean, it's you see the hypocrisy and all of that. And he makes some really good points, and he does it in a comical way. He's one of my favourite comedians, really, because he tells the world what's really happening, and he does it in a satire. And I think that our world, the original democracy that the Greeks came up with, was designed from the bottom up, not from the top down. It was democracy. In smaller groups, admittedly.
But it was also always designed to protect the interests of those in power.
Right. I think they'll always be making sure that they will be protected, and I think that that's a good point.
Exactly, and look at the Romans and the way that the Roman built their society, right? It was definitely hierarchical. It was definitely the interests of the few that actually were benefited, again. And that's I guess, the issue I've got fundamentally is we've got a lot of the population who basically don't necessarily, as we said right in our first show, they don't actually look up and ask questions because they're too busy burrowing away and doing what they're doing, right? But as soon as you start standing up and looking and asking questions, you start seeing this complexity, And the more that you tease the onion apart, the more that you realize that I'm a cog in a rather big set of wheels, right? Those cogs are actually being manipulated and controlled by some way or another for certain ends and purposes. And we have very little really self-control as to what precisely direction we can go in without tripping off the end of the process and end of the system, right?
Well, your ability to move around in that process is very limited.
Yeah,
because
exactly.
Because you don't have a lot of leeway. There seems to be nowhere you can go. Now, if we look at America, for example, what do we see when we look at America? Most of the time, we look at a TV, and we see what they want to see, what they want us to see. But if you go on the internet and you go onto YouTube and you start searching, you'll suddenly discover things like 53 blocks of Los Angeles have people that are homeless living in tents. But they focus on Ellen DeGeneres rather than worrying about the people living in the tents. And they tend to ignore that part of it, and they talk about how well the share market's going, and they talk about how well employment's going, and you look around and you say, well, I don't feel that rich. But do you know what I mean? And then also when you do go looking at things like Facebook and YouTube, of course, and Google, these are monopoly corporations. Now, if you go and you search on other sites and you type in the same information, you get different answers when you steer away from those major search engines. So once you start to go away from the major media groups, so you've got your television, your radio, you've got your YouTube, your Google, your Facebook, and they're the big ones. So they're monopolies. And they want to steer you down their path. And then when you go to see others and you find out different information, then you become a conspiracy theorist. It's rather like me, actually, Martin. And suddenly you're finding an alternative view. And our people go, but if that view is correct and the media come and question you on it and you put it forward, the media is going to say to you, but we're the media. You're a conspiracy theorist. You don't question us. You have to prove what you're saying. And if you get too close, guess what they do? They basically say, no, we're not going to talk about that subject. We'll stop. They will not discuss it. Now, what does that tell you about your media? What does it tell you about the lens that we're told? What does it tell you about all the things that you're told by your parents? We go back to that. What does it tell you about what's really happening in the world? What I see is no one can actually... You make scenarios, okay, Martin? Nothing wrong with those scenarios. The reason you make scenarios is, really, let's be honest, Martin, you can't be absolutely sure because you just don't know what they're going to do next, do you? Correct?
Well, there are too many variables, and trying to and take a particular position on that limited information base means you've got to be wrong, right? So that's why scenarios is a better way to go. But even then, of course, you have to change the scenarios as things get updated.
Well, I'll tell you what you could...
wasn't there 6 months ago.
Sure. I'll tell you what you could say, though. If you look at the way the world economy has been going, and you look at the way central banks have been behaving, ever since 1999 when Glass-Steagall was taken out by Bill Clinton, and that's a very important moment, I must add. That moment was a very significant moment. We basically went to pre-1929 era of banking, of deregulation. And what have the banks been doing? They've been gradually dropping the interest rates. Now, what does this do? Effectively, around the world, I'm going to call this the biggest robbery the world has ever seen in its history. That's a really good line. That's a great grab. The biggest robbery the world's ever seen in its history, because what it's doing, it's stripping away everybody's income because their purchasing power is dropping. And what's it doing? It's actually elevating asset prices. So the people who are very wealthy are doing extremely well. But the average person who's just trying to make a living, maybe buy a house, look after a family, they're heavily penalised. They're penalised if they save. They're penalised if they take on debt. They're penalised in every move they make. There doesn't seem to be much area for them to go to. And then, of course, in order to feed themselves, the cheapest way to do that is to go to a corporation. and buy from places like Coles, which have processed food, which takes you into this situation where your health can suffer. You know?
Yep.
Are you still
Well,
there?
and just on that, of course, if you look at the content of food, a lot of the food that's processed has high sugar content and high salt content. Partly the reason for that is that those ingredients are very much cheaper than the other ingredients that they could include. So it makes the weight up.
Oh,
And
sure.
Sure.
But sugar. Sugar's terrible.
I'm not saying sugar's good. I'm just saying that's the reason. Sugar's cheap.
Yes. Yeah, no.
Yeah.
But I mean, what about the idea that there are other cheap things, but sugar can also damage? And so that would be a benefit for a pharmaceutical company, for example. And as I said to a friend of mine some time ago, I believe things like cancer have probably been cured. And he didn't even hesitate with his response to say, oh, so you're telling me that all the doctors that go to university to study get together and collude and say, we're not going to tell anybody about this cancer cure. And I said, don't be stupid. How long? Certainly, I mean, things like, do you think that every single one of those doctors would stay quiet if they told them that? I don't think so. But if they have to pass a tertiary examination to become a doctor, and it's a corporate education, well, naturally enough, the corporations are going to twist the education for their benefit. So that includes things like economics. You know, if you go to economics, John Adams did say to me, he said it took him about 2 or 3 years to clear his head of all the stuff that they told him he'd been taught at university on economics, because it just didn't make sense. So when money can be printed out of thin air, and when you've got a system of control that goes all the way up to government, all the way through, and it's permeated through just about every part of our lives, we've got a system of control that people just don't realise is so controlled. It is. It's not a little, it's massively controlled. But most people think that their normal life, oh, that's the Dr. Evil thing there, their normal life, I have to put that in, is what they believe and what they see on the TV. And they look at people in respectable in suits and think, now that's a nice person. And if you see a person with tattoos and not dressed too well, that's a bad person versus that's a nice person. This is the illusion we have up here. And the person in the suit can be more crooked and do more damage, i.e. Westpac money laundering with billions of dollars. I mean, that's okay because the guy's dressed in a suit. But then this shifty-looking guy walking along the street might actually be helping people, but he's considered to be lower down the ranks. So this is the illusion of life that we have. And I did want to... There was... You remember Shakespeare said... now, this part you can edit out if it doesn't suit, but I've got my own twist on it. Shakespeare said, the world is a stage and we all have to play our part. And George's version of that in today's contemporary society goes something like, the world is a shit house and we all have to go to the toilet. You can include that if you like. You can take it out, Martin. But it's the contemporary version of modern life. And I'll leave that to you if you like to put that in. We might have to R-rate that out. But really, I mean, look at the world we live in. I mean, when I went to school and I was taught economics, it was very simple. You had a choice. It was push-pull inflation or pull-push inflation. And I thought, why do we have to have inflation? Well, that's just the way it is. Okay, I'll accept that. Look around at my peers and they all accepted it. I thought, well, they're accepting it. I'll accept it. This is the world that we live in. But the world that we live in is shrouded in secrecy. In massive secrecy. So much so. Things like, well, that's a matter of national security. Okay. And that brings you back to that famous speech that John F. Kennedy made where we are opposed to secret societies, to secret oaths, and to secret proceedings. And we decided long ago that, you know this speech, don't you, Martin? And I think that if anybody is watching this tonight, I think it's good to revisit that because I think that
Because
speech...
people think he's talking about Russia, of course.
No, he wasn't talking about Russia. He was talking about the world, the world that actually sits and runs government. A good example, Henry Kissinger has been around a long time. Nobody votes for him, but he's always there. And he's not democratically elected, but he has the ear of presidents. And we don't. The majority of the people don't have that control, but he's got that that immediate communication that we don't have. And that kind of, if anybody is wondering what to look at, just look at those things, because this is challenging people's thinking, and it's challenging them to say, well, perhaps your news and your politicians and your education is really not what you thought it was. It appears on the surface that way, but remember, the monopolies have enormous money power, enormous marketing power, and the average person doesn't. And what do? We look for credibility, and credibility seems to be at the top, not at the middle ground or lower ground. You know, I don't know if you've ever heard the term, well, who are you, when you meet somebody? They have no marketing power, no nothing. They may be very good at what they do, but that doesn't mean anything. I remember once somebody saw me with a Panasonic P2 broadcast camera, and they looked at me and they said, "Oh, you're a professional." And I said, "Why?" And they said, "Well, look at the camera you've got." And I said, "If I give you the camera, will that make you a professional?" "Oh, I don't know anything about that camera." And you say, "Well, how do you know what I know? And to what level of professional am I? How far am I really? Am I basic? Am I middle ground? Am I director of photography, even director? This is pretty high up. How far am I?" Well, they don't know. You can only give them results.
We've nearly been this an hour. So George, I guess in terms of some couple of closing comments from me, as a philosopher, I always want to ask the next question, the next question, the next question, the next question. So I always encourage people not to take at face value what they're told, not to take at face value the assumptions about the way things work. And as we said in our first show, we'll put a link below, that there is a set of implicit assumptions as the way things work, which often are not true. And I think we've demonstrated that. And in our second show, we also made the point that it wasn't just happenstance. Potentially there is, process and structure and maybe even conspiracy there that shapes the way things work. And I guess the thing to take away from today is that this is so wired into the way that society works and countries works and corporations work that we have very little choice but to dance the tune that is actually being served, as it were. And I sort of reflect on The Matrix, right? And I actually think The Matrix is quite an interesting film, because basically what it says there is a reality, but beyond it there's another reality. And the trouble is, if you go into that other reality and start thinking about it, then effectively you blow up the one that you're in. So it's very, very complex.
Well, it's I don't know that you blow up the reality you're in. You realise what the reality you're in is a better way to describe it.
The closing thought is, don't take anything for granted, right? It is worth asking hard questions and not necessarily just taking the simple stories portrayed in the mainstream media as being totally accurate and the complete picture. That it's very important to keep a skeptical, open mind, and frankly, ask those hard questions, because often you may find the questions, once you start asking them, will take you to another question, to another question, to another question, and the answers won't necessarily be very comfortable. But on the other hand, once you start down that track, it's very important not just to sort of turn back and think it's too hard, right? And that rabbit hole is actually worth exploring just a little bit, because if you do understand a little bit more about how things do work, and essentially, who is actually, in what situation and how it's being influenced, then that's step one towards perhaps being able to make some change and to do things differently, both as individuals and as a society, that could actually lead to a better outcome. Yeah. George, I appreciate your time this evening. It's been very interesting. I don't necessarily agree with all the points you've made.
No, you don't. I didn't want you to agree. I didn't.
No, but I absolutely defend your ability to express those opinions, and it'll be interesting to see what the comments are when this YouTube is posted. I'm sure there will be a range of views and opinions, which is great.
I invite them all along, Martin.
Yeah.
I think that's the nature of a healthy society, when we can actually express our views and discuss them and think about where this country is going.
And I want to leave you with this thought, which was from one of my other contributors, Salvatore Babonis, who basically said, because he was talking about conspiracy theories and things like that, and he said, look, 2 points. The first is conspiracy theories and the fact that there will be diversity of opinion is good, because that's demonstrating that democracy is actually working, right? And the second one, he says, quite often what was conspiracy theories will either die or actually will be proved to be right. But actually the bias often is that the conspiracy theories ultimately become true, which makes me a little bit worried about the pyramids. It's a brave new world, to quote Aldous Huxley.
All right.
George, I appreciate your time. Thank you once again. And I wouldn't be surprised if we do a part 4 sometime. There's always more to explore, isn't there, down the rabbit hole?
There is, and the rabbit hole is very deep, let me tell you.
Okay, take care.
All right, Martin.
Cheers.
Thank you.